Ho hum, la-di-da, la-di-da. Another straight-in ILS or RNAV approach. You can do them in your sleep, right? Even a VOR approach is no big deal since almost all of them are really done using GPS, with the VOR only for backup. You know, the briefings, nothing fancy, right? MSA, MDA, MAP. Hey, what else would you need? Well, maybe that would barely suffice most of the time. But the one time you don't carefully read and brief the approach plate is the time you get caught with your aeronautical pants down. At some airports in mountainous terrain, you may end up with your pants permanently down, so to speak. Welcome to another real world SF-50 flying video. This one is titled When You Really Need a Thorough Approach Briefing. Hello, I'm David Weeks. I've been flying professionally for over 50 years, starting as a CFI, then a charter pilot in light twins. I spent time as an air ambulance pilot in a Swearingen Metro, and I worked as a demonstration pilot for the Learjet factory. I had a 35-year airline career flying the 737-200 and 300, the A320 series, and I retired as a Boeing 787 captain. I'm also a current CFII. I have over 750 hours in the SF-50, and I'd like to share my SF-50 experience with you. Now, there may be other YouTube channels that have glitzier production values than this one. I like to spend my time writing and teaching about the SF-50, not doing post-production work. So just imagine this video is like a hangar chat session between friends. First, I do want to state clearly that the procedures in the Cirrus Vision Jet airplane flight manual and the material in the pilot's information manual are always controlling. This video is not flight instruction, nor is it ground school. These are simply my thoughts about briefing an unusual VOR approach in southern Mexico. My wife and I recently returned from a great trip to Oaxaca, Mexico, where we spent 4 full days with family, seeing the sights and eating the great Oaxacan food. We flew from Flagstaff, Arizona to Brownsville, Texas for gas, and then did the 2-hour leg into Hohocotlan Airport. By the way, the English speakers among us will enjoy learning that it's pronounced Hohocotlan. It's not Zozocotlan, and it's not Xochocotlan. Hohocotlan is a Nahuatl word that means place of sweet and sour fruits. I did the VOR Zulu approach to runway 1 in actual IFR conditions. Now, there's no straight-in approach to runway 19 as there is very high terrain just north of the airport. The reported weather was 2,500 overcast and 5 miles viz, but the actual conditions on the final approach course were a bit lower. I picked up the runway about 3 miles out in light rain and mist, which turned into a torrential downpour as I turned off the runway. Now, I've done this particular approach 2 times before, and while it's fun and it's different, it does require careful attention. First, the Oaxaca airport is a non-radar environment. So, how do you know that in advance? Look at the frequency box for Oaxaca approach at the top of the jet plate. What don't you see? Well, you don't see the little R next to the frequency, and that little R means radar services are provided. So here, with no R, we know that we won't get vectors for the approach. Now, we came in from the north on airway Upper Tango 151 from Veracruz, and we were talking to Mexico Center. Radar service from the center was terminated when we were handed off to Oaxaca approach. Now, another dead giveaway that you're on your own is that Oaxaca approach asked me to report 30 or 30 DME from the Oaxaca VOR. That's the only thing that tells approach where we are. I was next asked to report 10 DME north on the airway. Now, at that point, I expected to be cleared for the VOR Zulu runway 1, cross the Oaxaca VOR at or above 12,000, and report turning final. That is the standard procedure, more or less. Obviously, I had the procedure already loaded into the G3000. I plan to do the approach in GPS mode with the magenta needle on the PFD and load the Oaxaca VOR into NAV2 as the required raw data backup. I had checked all the legs, everything was copacetic. But there are more than just a few gotchas on this procedure. It is critical to read the notes and to read them carefully. Now, note 1 says DME required. Okay, that's no big deal for us, as GPS is an acceptable substitute for DME. Note 2 says maximum speed 160 knots or minimum for maneuvering. Now, that's something you rarely see on US approach plates. Now, you can see there's plenty of high terrain to the west of the final approach course. Okay, fine, but why does the speed matter? It's because that once you hit the 8 DME fix on the outbound leg, you simply make a right standard rate turn to intercept the final approach course inbound. Now, if you're screaming along at 250 knots indicated, which would be perfectly stupid, I think you'd run the risk of overshooting the final and getting too close to the rocks. 160 knots indicated makes for a much shorter turn radius. So I was cleared to cross the VOR outbound at 12,000 for above. Now, in reality, my descent clearance below 13,000 came late, and I was just below 13,000 when over the VOR. I wanted to make sure that I was down to 9,000 at or below, at or before the 8 DME fix. I don't like being high or too fast in a non-radar environment. Now, with the max speed of 160 indicated, even with idle thrust, I was not coming down as fast as I would have liked. If I'd slowed back to 140, the rate of descent would have been even less. So I dropped flaps 50%, and that got me down in time. At that point, I just kept the flaps at 50% until just outside the final approach fix. After the 8 DME fix and in the right turn, you can descend to 8,200 feet. And at this point, I was back on profile, so I slowed to 140. Now recall that approach asked me to report turning final. That means turning onto the final approach course. It does not mean report at the final approach fix. So I reported when I was at the 8 DME fix inbound, as that's the point where you intercept the final approach course. At the 8 DME fix, I got a flashing message on the PFD. Now, while I can't recall the exact wording, essentially it told me to switch to VOR on nav1. Now, I don't recall seeing this message when doing this approach once before, but naturally I did make the switch. So from 8 DME inbound, it's VOR navigation. Now with the nav source for number 1 on VOR, you won't get a distance showing on number 1 as we have no DME receiver. This is why I had previously tuned Oaxaca on nav 2 and had the nav source for 2 set to show GPS on number 2. As without that, a true DME receiver, and we didn't have a true DME receiver for Oaxaca and no GPS, I would not have been able to determine the final approach fix and the missed approach point. Approach then told me to contact the tower, which I did, and he asked me to report 5 DME, which is the final approach fix. In any event, I flew the rest of the procedure uneventfully. As I mentioned, it began raining very, very hard right as I was turning off the runway. Now, what if that little downpour had been right at the point I had to make the land or go around decision? Well, let's talk about the missed approach procedure for this approach, as it's more than just a bit funky. Note 3 says that in the event of a loss of engine below the MDA, you have to maintain a certain climb gradient. Well, fortunately for us, we don't have any climb gradient to maintain in the event of a loss of engine below MDA. If we're above 600 feet above ground level, we pull caps. But let's say we go missed. Let's also assume that we do all the fundamental go-around flying bits correctly, and we remember to push nav so the G3000 will fly the missed approach procedure. If your approach plate briefing just had you take a quick glance at the plan view, you'd see a climb, then a turn back to the VOR, and then you'd hold as published, right? Wrong, wrong, wrong. Sure, you do start with a climb and fly straight out to 5 DME. But after that, it's definitely an oddball missed approach procedure. Do you hold right away? No, 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 you do not hold right away. This is where you have to read and understand the plate and the procedure before you even start flying the approach. The missed approach says this: climb outbound on Oaxaca VOR radial 002 to 5.0 DME, then turn left within 7 nautical miles to Oaxaca VOR. Now, by the way, please do not turn early or start the turn below 6,800 feet, as you have a big hill with a 6,430 MSL tower not far off your left. Okay, so far so good. It continues, and then on the Oaxaca VOR radial 192 to proceed on the reverse approach track to the holding altitude. What? Wait a minute. Reverse approach track? What in the heck is reverse approach track? And also, what altitude do I hold at? Now, you don't see the 192 radial explicitly noted on the plan view, but you need to recall that the reciprocal of 192 is 012, and that's the inbound final approach course. You don't fly out the same way you began the approach, where you were flying in the direction of the little arrows. You fly out to 5 DME, make a sharp left turn not to exceed 7 DME, as there's a hell of a big hill to the north. You fly over the VOR, and then you fly outbound on the final approach course. The Mexican authorities call this flying the reverse approach track, and it is a term I have never, ever heard used in the US of A. So you fly outbound to 8 DME, turn left, intercept the 163 radial, and fly that inbound to the VOR. Now, the inbound course is reciprocal to the radial, so that's 343. Guys, and it just keeps getting better. Now, you have to hold. The holding course is 174 inbound, and the hold is right turns. Now, no leg distance or time is noted. So, since we're below 14,000 feet, the standard leg timing is 1 minute, and you can expect the G3000 to do a teardrop entry. But what altitude do you hold at? It's not stated in the missed approach instructions. Look at the number inside the holding pattern depiction. It says 12,000, and that is the holding altitude, unless ATC assigned a different altitude. Now, this is not how the holding altitude would be depicted on a US approach plate. All right, I don't know about you, but this approach has a number of gotchas that are not obvious. You find them only by carefully briefing all aspects of the approach, reading the notes, and making sure you know and understand the missed approach procedure. There's no radar here to hold your hand if you get lost. But don't let this approach scare you off. Armchair fly it a couple times, and then you too can fly down to Oaxaca and have a great South Mexico vacation. I'm David Weeks, and thanks for watching Real World SF-50 Flying.